Hi, this video is on the 2016 Econ 2 paper for the new AQA AS Economics course. We are going to be looking at the first 5 multiple choice questions. So let's start with question 1. Question 1 says changes in real GDP are used to measure. Let's first define what real GDP actually is. Real GDP stands for Real Gross Domestic Product, and it's a measure of the value of economic output adjusted for price changes, which is inflation. So if we measure changes in real GDP between 2 periods, we can see whether the economy is producing more or less goods and services. Therefore, we can see if the economy is growing or contracting. Thus, the answer for this question is C. Changes in real GDP are used to measure economic growth. So I'm just going to go through the other options and just explain what would measure them. So with inflation, we could use the CPI or the RPI, and that will tell us how prices are changing over time. The level of unemployment could be found by using the labour force survey, which will tell us how many individuals are employed. Economic growth is the answer, and the distribution of income could be found by using the Gini coefficient or something like that. So let's move on to question 2. The diagram below shows 2 aggregate demand curves for an economy. All other things being equal, the most likely cause of the shift from AD1 to AD2 is an increase in, and then we have 4 options. So let's first have a look at what makes up aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is made up by consumption, investment, government, exports, and imports. C, I, G, and X have a positive effect on AD, and M has a negative effect on AD. So we're looking for one of these factors to change, which will cause AD to shift outwards. Aggregate demand would shift outwards if there was an increase in any of the positive terms, which is C, I, G, and X, or a decrease in the negative terms, which is a decrease in imports. Option A is an increase in exports, and this would cause aggregate demand to shift outwards. Therefore, A is correct. Option B is an increase in the rate of inflation, and this would be an increase in the price level, and this would result in a movement up the aggregate demand curve, and therefore this is wrong. C is an increase in interest rates. If there was to be an increase in interest rates, this is a contractionary monetary policy, and this would cause aggregate demand to shift inwards. The final option is D, and this is an increase in the budget deficit. We can work out a government's budget by doing its taxation revenues minus its expenditure. If this figure is positive, it means the government is running a budget surplus. If this figure is negative, it means that they're running a deficit. If there was to be an increase in the budget deficit, it would mean that the government is either gaining less taxation revenue or they are spending more. If the government is spending more, it would result in an increase in G, and this would cause the aggregate demand curve to shift outwards from AD1 to AD2. If the government is getting less taxation revenue, which could be because they have decreased income tax or decreased tax on goods and services, e.g. a decrease in VAT, it would result in AD shifting outwards as well. This is because if consumers pay less income tax, it means that they have more disposable income, and this results in them consuming a greater quantity of goods and services. Thus, C increases and AD shifts outwards. So for this question, we actually had 2 correct answers, which are A and D. And they gave you the marks if you put A or D, or if you put both of them in the exam. This was just a mistake, so there would only ever usually be 1 correct answer. So let's move on to question 3. All other things being equal, the long-run aggregate supply curve of an economy is likely to shift to the right if there is an increase in ... A shift to the right of the long-run aggregate supply curve shows that the productive potential of the economy has increased. So we're looking for an increase in any of these factors which cause the long-run aggregate supply curve and the productive potential of the economy to increase. And the only option out of these that would cause the productive potential of the economy to increase is an increase in factor mobility, which is answer A. An increase in factor mobility could be either occupational mobility or geographical mobility. Occupational mobility looks at the extent that workers can work in multiple different industries and obtain multiple different jobs. If there was to be an increase in occupational mobility, it would mean that workers are able to work in more jobs in the economy. Therefore, the long-run aggregate supply curve would shift outwards. Geographical mobility looks at how easy it is to move from one place where there are no jobs to another place where there are jobs. If geographical mobility is high, it means that workers are easily able to move to where the jobs are. So job vacancies in certain locations will be filled quicker, and therefore the economy can produce more goods and services. And this is the long-run aggregate supply curve shifting to the right. So the answer for this question is A. Options B and D are changes to the short-run aggregate supply curve. If there was to be an increase in the raw material prices, it wouldn't change how many goods and services the economy can produce. It is still able to produce the same amount of goods and services, but it would have to produce it at a higher price level. So an increase in raw material prices or an increase in wage rates results in the SRAS curve shifting upwards, but the productive potential of the economy does not change. Option C is an increase in indirect taxation. Indirect taxation is taxes on goods and services, so it's taxes on consumption. If there was to be an increase in indirect taxes, it would affect the aggregate demand in the economy. Therefore, this answer is wrong. Question 4 says, a country has a slow rate of growth and productivity and rise in cyclical unemployment. All other things being equal, which measures are most likely to increase the rate of growth of productivity and reduce cyclical unemployment? Productivity measures the amount of output per unit of input, and if there was to be a rise in productivity, it would mean that we were producing a greater amount of output per unit of input. Cyclical unemployment arises from a lack of demand in the economy, and if there's a lack of demand in the economy, less goods and services are being demanded. And as labour is derived for the demand of the final good, if less goods and services are being demanded, less labour will be demanded, and this results in unemployment. So let's go through the 4 options and see which ones is going to increase the growth of productivity and reduce cyclical unemployment. Option A is increased investment and increased saving. If there was to be an increase in the investment rate, it would likely increase the rate of growth of productivity. If there was to be an increase in savings, it would mean that consumers would choose to save rather than consume, and this would cause consumption to decrease, and this would cause aggregate demand to shift inwards, and this would increase the amount of cyclical unemployment. Therefore, A is the wrong answer for this question. Option B is more government spending on training and a higher exchange rate. If the government was to spend more on training, and maybe education as well, this would cause the productivity of workers to increase. So this policy would likely increase the rate of growth of productivity. The second part of this option is to have a higher exchange rate. If there was a higher exchange rate, it would mean that your exports are now more expensive and foreign goods and services are now cheaper. This would result in exports falling and imports rising, and this would cause aggregate demand to shift inwards. An inward shift of aggregate demand would increase the rate of cyclical unemployment. Option C is decreased benefit payments and a lower budget deficit. A decrease in benefit payments would result in the level of consumption in the economy falling. This is because individuals who were receiving these benefit payments now receive less, and this means that they cannot consume the same amount of goods and services, thus consumption falls. A lower budget deficit means that the government is either taxing more or they are spending less, and this has a contractionary effect on the economy and will cause aggregate demand to shift inwards. So both a decrease in benefit payments and a lower budget deficit will result in aggregate demand shifting inwards, and this would increase the cyclical unemployment rate, and it would have no effect on the growth of productivity. Therefore, C is wrong. Option D is to have a lower taxation on firms and lower interest rates. If firms face lower taxation, it means that they have more money available to invest. If they increase the amount of investment that they undertake, it is likely that the productivity of their workforce would increase. So, lower taxation on firms would result in an increase in the rate of growth of productivity. Lower interest rates is an expansionary monetary policy, and this would cause aggregate demand to shift outwards. This would reduce the amount of cyclical unemployment, Therefore, the answer to this question is D, because the lower taxation increased the rate of growth of productivity, and lower interest rates results in a reduction in the amount of cyclical unemployment. This brings us on to the final question in this section, which is question 5. The diagram below shows two aggregate demand curves and the short-run aggregate supply curve for an economy. All other things being equal, which one of the following is the most likely cause of the movement of the economy from equilibrium at y1 to equilibrium at y2? The change in the equilibrium from y1 to y2 has come about because of the change in aggregate demand. Aggregate demand at y1 was AD1, and at y2 aggregate demand is AD2. It's at a greater level. So we're looking for one of the following four options to cause aggregate demand to shift outwards. Aggregate demand has the formula C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So we're looking for an increase in any of the positive terms or a decrease in the negative term. Option A is a decrease in imports, and imports have a negative effect on aggregate demand. Therefore, if there was to be a decrease in imports, aggregate demand would shift outwards from AD1 to AD2, and this would result in the movement from Y1 to Y2. So the answer for this question is A. Option B is an increase in savings. If there was to be an increase in savings, it would mean that consumers are choosing to save rather than consume, and this would cause a decrease in consumption. This would cause aggregate demand to shift inwards rather than outwards, and therefore B is wrong. C is a decrease in the money supply, and this would likely result in aggregate demand shifting inwards, which is not happening in question 5. Option D is an increase in productivity, and if there was to be an increase in productivity, it would mean the productive potential of the economy would increase, and this would cause the long-run aggregate supply curve to shift outwards. Productivity is supply side based, not aggregate demand side based. Therefore, D is wrong. There are videos for the rest of this past paper, and you can find these on YouTube. Alternatively, you can click the link in the description below, which will take you through to the website.